Welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined once again by the former fighter pilot, military analyst, and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, James. Good to be here.
I mean, we have so much to talk about today. I suppose the first place to begin is, what is your assessment of the situation on the front line in Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, it's good morning, James. It's a difficult time, I think, for Ukraine. It's been fallen off the media horizons because of the US elections and the like. But bluntly, Ukraine is on the back foot. So there's sort of two main areas, really. The Donbass, which we've been talking about, seems to be one of the big focuses for President Putin. And although progress by Russia has slowed, they are still making steady progress towards pushing their boundary right out to the boundary of the Donbass. The second one, of course, is you'll remember the Kursk incursion by Ukraine. Again, not much talked about that, but if you look at the maps now, it looks like Russia's pushed out Ukraine out of about a third of that territory. And there are reports that Russia's got up to 50,000 troops now moved into the area, possibly augmented by those North Korean troops we've been talking about, and potentially some conscripts that shouldn't be sent to the front line. But it's a moot point if they're going to defend Russia rather than going on the offense in Ukraine. I think the one caveat, though, I think trying to put some context around this is that the Chief of the Defence Staff in the UK announced this week that the average number of Russians that were casualties, lost their lives or casualties over the last month has been about 1,500 a day. Now, that is an enormous number. If you remember the battle for Bakhmut last year, that was described afterwards as the bloodiest battle since World War II. And at that time, it was about 900 a day being lost. So this advance by Russia is taking an awful toll on the forces. And you have to conclude from a military perspective that this is a big surge of push trying to achieve Russia's objectives by the 20th of January. What happens on the 20th of January is the inauguration of the next president. Trump has said he's going to solve the conflict in 24 hours. And undoubtedly, Putin wants to be in a position by that stage where he could, if he wanted to, be prepared to negotiate.
Well, we'll definitely come on to the implications of a second Trump presidency in a moment. Just on the Russian casualty rate, I mean, it's been very high for a long time now, and people have been questioning whether it is sustainable for a long time. But does the fact that we are now seeing, North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians in Kursk, for instance, does that speak to the fact that maybe Putin inevitably is going to have to look again at mobilization if this casualty rate continues?
Yeah, I think there's two different ways of looking at it, James. I mean, if you're looking at the way you've just described, if you saw this as it's going to last another couple of years, then the rate of casualties is not sustainable. President Putin has tried using the Wagner Group in the past. That turned on him. He's tried using convicts, but the supply of those has dried up. He's tried using mercenaries, i.e. offering very attractive packages to mercenaries. The trouble is that most mercenaries don't actually want to die. They're happy to fight but not die. And by all accounts, a huge number of them are dying. So they've suddenly, the recruitment rate for that has dried up. They've managed to find some forces in North Korea. That might sound like the answer to the Maiden's Prayer, but there's all sorts of reasons why that might not work well, not least of which North Korean forces, they haven't been fighting since the 1940s and 50s. And by all accounts, there's a language problem. They haven't been properly trained. And even there have been lots of reports that actually these guys are not well fed either. The last time one of the soldiers from North Korea tried to escape, I think it was 2017. He was shot as he made his way across the border several times, but managed to escape into South Korea. The surgeons operated on him then, but found, I think it was a 27 centimetre intestinal worm and a whole load of parasites. And part of that is just part of poor feeding for their troops, when most troops around the world are really well fed because you want them to be fit and well. And this was elite forces. So it's only one person, but it does talk to the fact that North Korea may well have provided numbers, but whether those are effective forces, and it's very likely, although they may serve with pride for their North Korean leader, it's quite likely many of them will not return home on their feet.
What about losses in a different sense for Russia? What about equipment, supplies, even tank losses?
Yeah, that is really interesting. So when we look at people, The question really is, Russia is huge. It could just mobilize more and more people. It's much bigger than Ukraine, and Ukraine, by all accounts, is struggling. The problem with that, of course, is that already the mothers of some of those soldiers are starting to raise petitions against the Russian leader. And he knows it will be deeply sensitive if he was to mobilize more people. The challenge, of course, then around equipment is that they've lost a lot of equipment. Now, it depends which metric you look. Let's use tanks as an example, because that's quite an emotive one. By all accounts, they've lost well over 3,000 of their main battle tanks. That's a huge number. But if you went to Wikipedia and saw how many tanks that Russia has, it's something like 13 or 14,000. So again, you look at it and go, well, it's only a very small percentage. When you actually analyse the numbers a bit closer, though, what Russia has done is that ever since World War II, if the tanks run out of life and they're being replaced, they don't melt them down, they put them into storage. And what Russia's been doing is pulling them out of storage again. So it's been bringing out of storage T-54, 55s and T-62s. The number largely relates to the year it came into service. So these are very old tanks. Now, do they stop bullets still? Yes. Can you still drive around the battlefield with them? Yes. Do they still have a gun? Yes. The challenge, of course, is, though, that they're not modern. So first of all, they don't withstand anti-tank weapons very well. Secondly, it's very difficult to fire on the move because they don't have any of the technology there. They also cook off, so it's more easy to wipe them out. And of course, they don't operate well in the high-tech battle space. So they're not very effective as modern tanks. So what Russia's been hurting with is most of its modern tanks have been taken out. They are still providing more, but the rate of reduction is tiny compared to the rate to which they're losing them. That will have a long-term impact. And for you, James, I think part of for the listeners, why it's key is because when I was serving, one of the driving threats for our nation was Russia and the other one was China. We were scared about what Russia's capability was. Now, Russia's seen such a destruction of its military capability that bluntly, from an equipment perspective, it doesn't pose the same threat to the West as it did at the start of the war. And although its soldiers are battle hardened, it doesn't have the equipment. Now, will it get the equipment back again? Yes, it will. Most analysts believe it'll be at least 5 years, potentially 10 years before it's restocked. But given that it got such a bloody nose fighting against Ukraine, you'd have to think that it would think twice before taking on a Western power like NATO, because our kit and equipment is so much better.
Donald Trump winning the US presidential election, he'll of course be inaugurated, as you say, on the 20th of January 2025. What do you think his approach to Ukraine will be? There has been so much speculation that he will be more hostile to Ukraine, more hostile to continuing aid for Ukraine. And yet other people actually saying that his call with Zelensky last week went relatively well, and that maybe, we shouldn't take him at his word when it comes to, ending the war within 24 hours. What is your reading of what he is likely to do?
It's fascinating, isn't it? What a character. I think you have to look back in history. So when he did his first term, three things that struck to mind was he was going to build a wall, continuous wall to keep along the border with Mexico to keep everybody out. He was going to bring peace to the Middle East, and he was going to deal with the North Korean leader. To my memory, not one of those things was actually seen through. So but what it does do is give a clear example of Trump's intent. And whilst his intent around NATO, for example, has been, people shouldn't live under the umbrella of security that America provides, people should pay for it. And actually, we've seen over the last few years, it's gone from only a third of NATO countries actually paying their 2% to actually 2/3 now. So that rhetoric has actually shaken the tree a bit. When it comes to Ukraine, though, I think President Zelensky will be probably rightly concerned about where this is going, because Trump at his heart is about America first. Now, every country looks after its own interests first, but America puts a huge amount of resource towards Ukraine. And undoubtedly, President Trump's view is that he's simply backing a war that is not winnable. And therefore, he wants to bring it to an end. He's famously said in 24 hours. The problem is that you can't, President Trump, you either broker a peace or you impose a peace deal. You only broker it if both sides are willing to talk, but they need somebody to act as an intermediary. Well, it's pretty evident to me that neither side is ready to talk. Or you impose. Now, how does America impose a solution? It can probably do it over Ukraine because it has the supplies of weapons and money, and therefore without those, Ukraine would struggle. But how would it impose a solution with President Putin? And it's not entirely clear. I think one of the things that if Putin's objective is to get as far as he can by the 20th of January, he would almost certainly want to clear the Kursk region of any Ukrainians, because he wouldn't want to negotiate with Ukraine still holding some Russian land. But actually, if Putin has largely achieved his objectives of land, he'll never give that land up. But if you were now Putin, what would you want in return for stopping the war? Probably lifting the sanctions and, probably making sure Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And I suspect Trump will love to do a deal, and there might be, therefore, the grounds for actually imposing a solution. But as a military guy, that scares me bluntly, because, it's like putting a sticky plaster over somebody with a heart attack. It might look good, but it doesn't solve the problem. And the danger is there that you reward President Putin for his aggression. And therefore, where next? Also, what message does that send to the Iran leadership, to the North Korean leadership, and most importantly to China, who are looking at Taiwan, wondering what they should do about that? I think there are some grave implications for national security. But it does look like Trump inexorably is looking. It's more important. Even his aides are talking about our conversation is less about territory and more about peace.
I mean, it's really interesting because on yesterday's episode of Frontline, I was speaking to Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, a former US State Department official, who actually was more optimistic about what a Trump presidency might mean for Ukraine. And he argued that, Trump would be able to bring Russia to the negotiating table by saying, look, if you don't come to the negotiating table, I will arm Ukraine to the teeth. And because it's Trump, they will take that threat more seriously. What do you make of that?
There's definitely an option of, I do think carrot and stick, the carrot Trump can offer is around, readmitting Russia to the global world order. The stick is undoubtedly arming Ukraine to the teeth. The problem with that practically is that, as we've discussed on your podcast before, one of the things the West is reluctant to do is to provide its state-of-the-art weapons to Ukraine. Bluntly, because there is still corruption there. The danger is some of these weapons will fall into Russian hands, and technology is the West's asymmetric advantage. A good example of that is the Storm Shadow missile. It's a very, very effective missile, but it's about 30 years old. We as a nation bought 1,000 of them. We've used about 200. We only think we need 300 or 400, so we're going to upgrade those to modern 21st century standard. But we had a load of them that we were either going to pay industry to decommission, or we gave them to Ukraine. And even if they fell into enemy hands, it's 30-year-old technology. It didn't matter. If we were to absolutely arm Ukraine to the teeth, which we could do, it would provide a phenomenal capability to Ukraine's hands. In addition, bluntly, we should be talking about a no-fly zone, because I think that's the next thing that the West could do, that would say, we're not intending to attack anywhere in Russia, but we are going to stop you attacking into Ukraine. And there are steps, I think, that America could do to make life a lot more difficult for President Putin. But there are all sorts of security issues, as I've outlined. And of course, to date, President Putin's been very effective at shaking that nuclear saber rattling that's threatening, Armageddon. I'm a veteran of the Cold War, and we live with that every day. 30 years we haven't been talking about it. People get scared. I think Trump will be much more robust about that, because he was very robust with the North Korean leader. And I think he'll call Putin's bluff on that one. So it won't be as effective. And therefore, Trump will stand eye to eye with him and say, look, if you do continue with this, we are forced to up the ante with you. And therefore, if you've achieved what you want to achieve, which it looks like for now, it looks like Putin might have done, then there may be a deal to be done. I think the other side to that coin, though, James, is also, if you're Zelensky, you'll be spitting tax at that conversation, but you might not have much choice. But what you will be interested in is, how do I rebuild my country? Where does the investment come to rebuild? And secondly, where's the security guarantees? Because after the Budapest Memo of 1994, when the US, the UK and Russia all guaranteed the security of Ukraine if it gave up its nuclear weapons. They won't be happy with a signature because, frankly, Putin ripped that up and in he went. There'll have to be something far more tangible. If it's not NATO, what is it? And there has been some talk about United Nations buffer zones, potentially bilateral or trilateral arrangements with British or American bases somewhere in Ukraine. All of that is to be negotiated, but it's a lot more than simply the peace. It's also how do you create an enduring peace? And this isn't just one step that Putin is going to repeat once he's refurbished his military capability.
I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, a former Director of Policy Planning at the US State Department and a former US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. Ambassador, welcome to Frontline.
Great, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Wanted to start by talking about the events of the past week. It's hard to ignore the outcome of the US presidential election. There has been so much said about what Donald Trump may or may not do with regards American support for Ukraine. What is your sense of how he's likely to approach things?
Well, I think it's always prudent to be very cautious in interpreting anything that President Trump says, especially on the campaign trail, as gospel. I think he says a lot of things. Some of it is simply to test out certain ideas. Others are provocative, perhaps on purpose. On Ukraine, he's actually said a lot of things, and most of the more controversial ones have been reported, such as he'll end the conflict in a day. But he's also had a lot more thoughtful comments about it and what it would take to end this terrible conflict and how he believes it should come to a conclusion as soon as possible for the benefit of everyone.
So when, for example, he said that comment about I could end the war in 24 hours, should we discount that? I mean, it's been widely seen that he is more skeptical about support for Ukraine than the Biden administration has been. Or do you think that is purely a bluff and that he may actually turn out to be more supportive of Ukraine than many people think?
I think it's actually neither. I think he's indicating or signaling, if you will, by these statements that he believes that he is perhaps uniquely able to bring an end to this conflict. I think that he feels that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords in his first term. I think he sees this as a vehicle for him ending a conflict and winning the Nobel Peace Prize, something that was given to President Obama but was denied to him. So I think that he is actually a little bit more thoughtful about what it's going to take. He knows that it takes compromise on both sides. And as far as the Biden administration, let's remember that President Trump actually released weapons to Ukraine that the Obama administration had prevented, including Javelin anti-tank weapons. He placed sanctions on Russia when he was president, and he opposed Germany's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Russia because it would make Germany overly dependent on Russia for energy security. So I think if you look at the full record, you'll see that he hasn't exactly been a pushover for Mr. Putin.
I was speaking to someone earlier, a Times journalist who covers the war in Ukraine, and he said that if this idea of a demilitarized zone would probably at the moment appeal more to Kyiv than it would to Moscow, because Ukraine are anxious. They might be in a mood now to freeze the front lines because of the advances that Russia are making. But from Moscow's point of view, they would be more reluctant because, as you say, Ambassador, there is this issue of, well, who would be patrolling it? Who would be policing it? And if you had, say, NATO troops in land bordering Russia, you can understand why Vladimir Putin would consider that a non-starter.
Well, it's a truism. It's going to take both sides to make compromises. If Russia feels that it has the upper hand and doesn't need to compromise now, then it'll continue to pursue the fighting. I think the Ukrainians have been remarkably brave and courageous in fending off a much larger country. And so it's unclear exactly where both sides are psychologically in terms of wanting to end this right now. But again, it's all on the question of whose terms are going to prevail, who has the greatest amount of leverage. And again, here's where the United States can come into play. President Trump has said that if Putin doesn't agree to compromise, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth, and he will back them with all the might that the United States has. So again, an issue where he's probably trying to create some leverage, trying to see what the response might be. But the truism is it's going to take compromise on both sides and a willingness to do that. And right now, we don't have that present.
It's interesting you say that Trump has hinted that he might be prepared to, as you say, arm Ukraine to the teeth if Russia's not in a mood to compromise. I mean, this issue of US military aid to Ukraine is a very live one, obviously, and Donald Trump Jr. shared a post on social media over the weekend that showed President Zelensky of Ukraine with a caption on it saying, "Point of view, you're 38 days from losing your allowance," implying somehow that America might cut off military aid to Ukraine. What do you make of both Donald Trump Jr. sharing such a post, but also the issue of whether Trump will continue military aid for Ukraine?
Well, last I checked, Donald Trump Jr. doesn't have a position in this administration. He's certainly entitled to his opinion. And there are people within the president's circle who believe that. J.D. Vance, perhaps most notedly. But there are also others who believe that Ukraine's fight is our fight. It's Europe's fight. It's a fight for certain values that we believe in and should be defended. And it's also a fight that we know that China is watching. And so it's not just what happens in Ukraine, but it's about restoring American deterrence in Asia and across the Middle East, because we've seen recently what happens when Iran becomes emboldened and Hamas and Hezbollah go on the rampage. So I think that it's a little bit more complicated than just saying your allowance is up. And there's one other factor. I think the president will be impressed by the fact that 80 to 90% of all American aid to Ukraine is actually benefiting American workers and American manufacturers. So this actually is something that helps us economically in terms of ginning up the military machine that we need to compete in a dangerous world. So again, I just think that we ought to take with a grain of salt, a large shaker of salt perhaps, what President Trump has been saying so far.
And as ever with any administration, I'm sure there will be some internal division over what the correct approach should be towards Ukraine. Do you think for those who want to continue arming Ukraine, do you think the best argument to take to President Trump is almost to put it in that wider geopolitical context, that it's in China's interest for Russia to do well, that it's in Iran's interest for Ukraine to fail? Do you think, therefore, if it's put in those terms, President Trump may be more sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause?
Well, I think we've seen that President Trump is not cut from the same cloth that most American presidents have been since the end of the Second World War. He doesn't really believe in the international order that the United States constructed and has led for the last half century plus. I think he sees his intervention as something more personal and something more transactional. So I think the best arguments for supporting Ukraine are going to be how they can benefit the United States, how they can benefit his presidency. And again, if he can broker a deal that's sustainable, that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, that enhances European security, that enhances deterrence in Asia and across the Middle East, then I think he'll feel that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. And guess what? He will.
It sounds almost, Ambassador, that you are more optimistic about Donald Trump's likely approach to Ukraine than a lot of Ukraine supporters are.
Well, I'd like to be cautiously optimistic, let's put it that way. It doesn't do a lot of good to be pessimistic in life, I found. I think that there are arguments, as you mentioned, that can be made for the president and for other people in his administration, because you're right, there are going to be divisions, there'll be a wide variety of opinions expressed. But I think that he's also going to want to see the Europeans step up in a major way. This was a theme of his first term, where only 3 countries in 2014 were hitting the NATO goal of 2% of their GDP. Now it's 2/3, but frankly, that means 1/3 aren't. And 2% doesn't look nearly as sufficient as it did 10 years ago, given the international environment. So I think it's going to be part of a broader conversation he's going to have with the Europeans. And of course, you then fold in trade, and it's going to make for a pretty heady cocktail. But I am not pessimistic at all. I do think that the United States will support Ukraine under President Trump. But I do think that every war must end, and this one is going to end in a negotiated arrangement. And I think that he is very well placed to actually help lead that effort.
And just finally, to return to that point about a potential timeline for a peace agreement or a negotiated settlement of some kind. How long do you think it might take? I mean, okay, take it with a pinch of salt when Donald Trump talks about 24 hours and he can end this war. But do you think within the first few months of him taking office, we may see a major breakthrough? Or do you think in a year's time, we will still very much be talking about fighting in Ukraine?
Well, again, it takes two to tango, so a lot of it's going to depend on what Russia and Ukraine want to do. I think it's possible to have a ceasefire within a relatively short period of time, certainly within the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Then working out the details while that ceasefire is preserved could take a year or probably longer. So I think it may happen in phases if it's going to happen. But I do think it's possible that there should be a ceasefire by the middle of this coming year.
Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, James.
And I'm delighted to be joined by the historian and Russia specialist Amy Knight, who worked for 18 years at the US Library of Congress as a Russia-Soviet affairs specialist and was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And the New York Times has described Amy as the West's foremost scholar of the KGB. Amy, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I wonder what you think the reaction in the Kremlin has been to Donald Trump's election victory last week.
Well, it's interesting. It's been quite muted. As you know, President Putin was one of the few world leaders not to call up Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, on the telephone and congratulate him. There were later some rumors that there had been a phone conversation between Putin and Trump, but Dmitry Peskov, Putin's publicity person, press person, denied that. So I think basically that the reaction from the Kremlin has been muted for two reasons. Obviously, if they were really happy that Trump was elected, and in my opinion, they probably are, they can't show it because that would be bad for both Putin and Trump, because they're going to be, first of all, hopefully there'll be some negotiation about the Ukraine conflict. Well, then secondly, I think actually nobody here and also in Russia really knows what to expect from Trump. So I don't think the Kremlin or Putin, feel really certain about how he's going to behave. And let me put it this way. If those of us who live in the United States and follow politics closely, we don't know what to expect, then you can imagine, the Kremlin has the same problem.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. And, there is this sense that Ukraine would have been happier with essentially the continuity Biden administration, so maybe Kamala Harris winning, and Moscow might have been happier with the return of Donald Trump. But just because it's happier doesn't mean it is necessarily happy. And there is still a scenario in which potentially if Vladimir Putin refuses to negotiate about a potential peace settlement or refuses to accept Trump's demands, that Trump may even double down on support for Ukraine.
Yes, this is always a possibility. It's interesting because I looked at the long address that President Putin gave at the Valdai conference. I think it was November 7th. And he was asked about the Ukraine conflict. He didn't discuss Trump, but he talked a lot about what was happening in Ukraine in his sort of Vel terms, because it isn't a war, as we all know. And but it was interesting. I mean, Putin was had some pretty strong words, and this was the day after Trump was elected, right? And he kind of doubled down on pretty much everything. In particular, it reminded me of the sort of the original motivation for Russia in going into Ukraine in February 2022, which was this fear of NATO. the Kremlin and Putin really, really, really don't want Ukraine to join NATO or to have a security arrangement with NATO. And this was made clear again when Putin spoke at the Valdai conference. And I think that would be a huge stumbling block for any kind of negotiation.
Do you think, because one of the ideas that has been sort of put out there by people close to Trump in recent days is this idea of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think that is a non-starter from Moscow's perspective? Because, to me, the obvious hurdle there is, well, who would be policing this DMZ? And if you had Western or even NATO troops there, that clearly would antagonize Vladimir Putin. So what do you make of that, Amy, as an idea?
I don't think that would go over with the Kremlin. I think it's pretty clear that the Kremlin feels that they have to. I mean, they have about 18% of Ukrainian territory right now. And then we have Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region, although quite not a large area. So I think that that the Kremlin, at the very least, would have to hold on to what they have. But they really aspire to 4 regions in eastern Ukraine. So that's one thing. But anything demilitarized, they want a neutral Ukraine. They want this chunk of Ukrainian territory. They want a neutral Ukraine. Now, my view is that everybody's been talking recently, focusing on the victories that the Russian troops have had in eastern Ukraine. And they're beginning to take back a little bit of Kursk. And they've brought in all these Korean soldiers. So it looks like, Russia has the bargaining, is on top in terms of the bargaining situation. But I think we have to remember that, of course, I feel like kind of a broken record when I say this, that this is wearing on Russia and their ability. First of all, the fact that they had to bring in Korean troops shows that they have a real manpower problem. Now, so do the Ukrainians. But, it's not like Russia can just go on and on and on with all these really significant numbers of fatalities in Russian forces. So I think that well, if I were advising Trump, I would definitely say the longer this can last, the harder it's going to be for Russia. And the more likely they would be to make some sort of concessions. But of course, the flip side is that this is also very hard for Ukraine. And we could talk about the possibility that Ukraine would be given permission to use these long-range missiles inside Russia. If that were to happen, that would be a game changer, I think.
And so if you think that Putin will have to make some kind of concession if he wants a kind of settlement sooner rather than later because of fear of it dragging on and maybe him having to launch a fresh wave of mobilization with all the political problems that entails, what might a Russian concession look like? Ukraine might need, if it's going to cede some territory, it might need a guarantee around its security, for example, NATO membership. But how would Moscow view that? And can you see any scenario in which Putin would agree to that as part of a settlement?
I really, really, really can't. I think that Putin is far more likely to be willing to make some concessions on the amount of territory that Russia would end up with than he is to make the concession of allowing Ukraine into NATO. Because, as I say, that really was kind of the motivation initially. Is Russia's fear of NATO, and that they and how realistic it is another question. But they just really don't want their largest neighbor, Ukraine, to be a member of a NATO state, because then they could bring troops in. So for Russia, I think that's unacceptable. And And this makes it very hard. I mean, it's interesting for both Trump, President-elect Trump, and Putin, because Trump, I don't think he's promised on day one that he's going to reach a peace agreement, but I really don't think he can afford to just sort of give away Ukraine, even if he could force Zelensky into an agreement that would be very disadvantageous for Ukraine. He could, the scenario is he'd say, you don't get anything more from us if you don't do this. But I just am not sure that would be a win situation for Mr. Trump. But then we have the alternative for President Putin just at this point, which is if he were to make concessions at all. I mean, remember, in February 2022, Russian troops aimed to occupy all of Ukraine. They've lost, estimates say, 600,000 Russian soldiers. So it's not going to look very good for Putin to say, okay, we've changed all of our goals and we're going to do this. So really, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. And my feeling will be that there won't be any kind of agreement. I think it's going to drag on. And I think people are going to wait and see how the chips fall, what happens with, as you say, possibility, all sorts of other things. But I would not anticipate that on, day one of Trump's administration that he's going to sit down with Putin and Zelensky.
Hello, it's James here. We'll be right back with Frontline in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about our brand new YouTube channel called Times Radio History. And if you like Frontline, I have a feeling you're going to love this. Every week, we explore a different battle or moment in history and replay it, asking ourselves what the long-term consequences might have been had things played out differently. Already, we've done episodes on D-Day, on the Battle of Gettysburg, on Stalingrad, on the First Battle of Ypres in World War I, and our latest episode is all about the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, one of the key moments of the American Revolutionary War. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. It's called Times Radio History. We'll put a link in the description below. Please do check it out.
And talk to me, if you can, Amy, about some of the internal pressures that will be on Vladimir Putin at the moment when it comes to any potential negotiations. I mean, everyone's aware of the political problems when it comes to potentially a future mobilization, or indeed why it's unpalatable for him to have Ukraine in NATO. I think when you were last on Frontline, you used the term, there's a choir of discontent around Putin in the Kremlin. Would they be chiming up if he was seen to cede anything too valuable to Ukraine?
Well, when you say they, we're talking about, it's not like the elite is one, consensual group. I think the military, obviously, they don't want to come out of this whole thing looking like losers. But I think quite a few members of the elite, and I've talked about this before, would really just like to see an end to this war. And because I think it's pretty clear if we look back on how things have played out, this really has been Putin's war. It was his idea to invade Ukraine in 2022. And remember, he really didn't consult very many members. So this is kind of his personal project. And I do think that if he gave if he allowed some sort of concessions, the kinds of things we've been talking about, I don't think that all the members of his government, I think many members of his government would be okay with that because they want this over. I think the problem might be the military, but even they could be talked into something. I think it's really more going to be Putin's decision and his perception of how it's going to go down with the public if he does back down on all these claims. But he certainly, as of last week, didn't look like he was prepared to do that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to a Ukraine-based global affairs analyst with more than 2 decades experience in humanitarian work and international journalism. Michael Bociurkiv is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has been a spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also an author and a regular commentator for many international media outlets, including Frontline. Michael, great to see you again. Welcome back. If we just have a little look at what President-elect Donald Trump's initial choices are in terms of appointments, what are the ones that you are interested that can give us an indication of his attitude and his policy towards Ukraine and the war?
Well, it's pretty mind-boggling, and it raises the question of what kind of how do these folks in the Trump and the MAGA circle view the institutions of the White House, of the Pentagon, and so on. The recent pick for the Justice Department, for instance, signals that he's appointing loyalists who have absolutely no qualifications, but he can rely on them to be his kind of pit bull to go after opponents or those who have crossed over the line in his mind, in his warped mind. But there are, we really expected, for example, former Secretary of State and CIA Director Mike Pompeo to come into the administration. We thought Nikki Haley would come in, but those have been crossed out. But the Mark Rubio has been apparently chosen as Secretary of State. And I think that's a fairly good choice, all things considered, because the big fear, of course, running up to the election and fears of another Trump presidency is that most of the responsible grown-ups in the room have either fled or been crossed off of any Trump list. So who are you going to pick from? But there's quite a few more. And let's not forget that a lot of these picks have to go through Congress, through the Senate. I am also wondering, for example, what's going to happen to the U.S. ambassador here in Kiev. She's not regarded as very strong, close to Mr. Biden. I think you'll see a replacement there. And then also, interestingly, Kate, in terms of new appointments, I think we're going to see a change of faces at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, a very, very, very key post. Oksana Makarova, who has become very well known to folks in the United States over the course of the war, has been very harshly criticized by the Trump people for Mr. Zelensky's last visit to the United States. So I think we'll see a new appointment there. But there is actually criticism of how Team Zelensky or Team Ukraine are handling the transition right now. We don't see many of their faces on Fox or the other big networks or down in Mar-a-Lago lobbying for more Ukraine aid. So that's a bit of a concern as well.
And why is that not happening?
Well, I think the last time you and I spoke, it was around the time that Foreign Affairs Minister Dmytro Kuleba was ousted out of his post, very highly regarded, very impressive, very articulate. And, I would never for 1 second compare the Zelensky administration to the Trump administration, but there is a sense here that at the end of the day, the big thing that counts here is loyalty, sometimes over skill, over track record. And I think that's what happened with Mr. Kuleba, sadly. Instead, they appointed one of his junior deputies, who is best known for rising up early in the morning when second-grade foreign affairs minister would come to Kiev and he'd present a bouquet of flowers or whatever to the arriving train. So, he's hardly as articulate as Mr. Kuleba. So I think they're fumbling on a key area right now. And, even at the beginning of the Zelensky administration, they did get rid of or they ignored a lot of really, really effective technocrats who were in place there. So, at the end of the day, you have to play with the cards you have. But I think some of this was kind of self-inflicted pain, what they're facing right now.
Just two appointments I wanted just to ask for your thoughts on by President-elect Donald Trump, just to get your thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard, his choice as Director of National Intelligence, quite an interesting one in her stance on foreign policy, because when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, she claimed it could have been avoided if the Biden administration and NATO had acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns about NATO. I mean, people say things sometimes, and when they actually get the job, they change their stance. But does this tell us anything about Trump's attitude towards President Putin and the kind of claims he makes?
Well, I can't get too specific about her track record because, I'm not familiar with her, but she does fit into this narrative that is spun by people like the vice president-elect and others in the Trump camp that, it was the West that provoked this war because the West, members of NATO, wanted to push the NATO boundaries right up to Russia. And by doing so, as the argument goes, is that they provoked Mr. Putin because, one could argue that there was no way he could have NATO's eastern borders right up against Russia's. But, it's already close anyway. If we'll look at, the Baltic states, that area, Scandinavia. And I think this is an inevitability, and it is, for example, in Ukraine's constitution that Ukraine is going to pursue a path to NATO. So it's hard to say where they will go with this. I think you're right, is that once in their office and they receive the proper briefings, and hopefully they won't fire the entire bureaucracy and they'll get good advice, that their eyes will open and see what's really going on. And I think hopefully they'll come and visit Ukraine. In fact, President Zelensky invited Mr. Trump here to see what is really going on, because briefings are one thing, but once you come here and you see how people feel, the damage, the displacement, and so on, it really does open up your eyes, especially the degree of war crimes that are going on right now on the Russian side. So let's see what happens. But there's also a kind of habit among Mr. Trump and his circle to say things one day, they're challenged with it the next day, and then they deny saying it. And that's a problem too right now, because they'll blame the fake news on all sorts of things. It's going to be a real circus, I think, in the next coming years. We'll see.
If we could just talk for a moment about what you're hearing from the front lines, those returning from them, what are they telling you about the pressures they're facing in terms of the manpower and equipment, and what effect is the high demand for infantry soldiers really having?
Well, I go on information I receive from friends of mine who are in humanitarian aid or helping the armed forces go to the front line, and also foreign correspondents who come back from there. And the number one problem seems to be infantry, the lack of soldiers, the lack of replacement. You have a lot of soldiers there, and the first wave were experienced but more advanced in age, who have been there with very little rotation. And they're very, very tired, and they're under a lot of fire. I believe the target for recruitment right now is 150,000 or so. Probably they'll get 100,000. But as I mentioned earlier, there is quite a bit of resistance, or let's call it unwillingness, for young people to go to the front line and fight. But I think, I can't speak for ordinary Ukrainians, but perhaps the message here should be ramped up to ordinary Ukrainians and to those who have left the country, is that this is an existential fight for the country, and all hands on deck. Every possible individual is needed to fight. But, the other problem is, Kate, is that if you're sent to the front line and you don't have the proper kit to fire back at the Russians or to defend yourself, well, that could cause anxiety and fears as well. And the rate
I heard someone saying about that. It's not that morale is low and that people don't want to fight. It's that they just want to have the equipment to be able to do so, and they're prepared to do so. It's more that.
Exactly. Yeah, but Ukraine has had an incredible track record. I mean, with basically no navy, they've been able to sink 1/3, if not more, of Russia's Black Sea fleet with this drone technology, and a lot of these drones that, for example, closed down Moscow airports the other day. They're manufactured right here, and they have incredible range, incredible firepower. So let's not forget, I mean, the wars of today are also turning into technology wars or hybrid wars. And Ukraine is really, really strong on that front. A lot of technology experts and talent here who have not left or who are working remotely and helping the war effort. And, I mentioned the hybrid war effort. I should also say that I am flabbergasted at how little resources, at how little effort European countries are doing to push back Mr. Putin or punish him for the shenanigans that are happening where you are in the United Kingdom or on European soil, from poisoning or killing people, whether it's in the United Kingdom or Spain with military grade means, or by causing havoc. For example, in the United Kingdom, there was a warehouse used by Ukrainians that was burnt down, meddling in elections, misinformation on a very, very wide scale. And I know the European leaders in Brussels have raised the alarm on this, but it's not enough just to raise the alarm or complain about it. You have to back it up with actions and with money. And to end this point, I think one thing, and I've said this probably a million times, including with you, is the only one thing that Mr. Putin understands is strength. So, the EU or its allies may commit a certain amount of money, but Mr. Putin can snap his fingers and double or triple that. So more resources have to be put aside to fight this Russian hybrid war. Otherwise, the Russian war effort will come much, much more to the doorsteps of ordinary folks in the United Kingdom or anywhere in Europe.
And I know that you've been thinking a lot about the wider consequences of the war in Ukraine. And North Korea has this week ratified its defence pact with Russia. What are the potential ramifications of the deal to have consequences far beyond Ukraine's borders?
Well, let me be very blunt. This is now a global war. This is a globalized war. It has been for quite some time. Let's not forget the role of Iran in providing the deadly drones that are striking Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities on a daily basis. And yes, the North Koreans have been providing lots and lots of ammo to the Russians and missiles as well. We know that because the Ukrainians pick up the pieces and they see the markings of North Korea on there. And then in addition to the estimated 10,000 North Korean soldiers joining Russians in the battle for the return of Kursk. I just read a report this morning that probably there's 20,000 more on their way from DPRK. They do not have modern battlefield experience, and they are receiving Russian training in the Russian Far East. I don't know how much that will work out for them, because we see the meat grinder that is happening. I think the latest figure is 1,400 Russian dead and injured every day. So those North Koreans could be returning home in boxes. But imagine for a moment that if thousands of them do survive and go back to DPRK, what kind of threat does that pose to peace in the Indo-Pacific region? People have to start thinking about that as well. People have to start thinking about, what is Russia offering in return to Tehran and to Pyongyang for their assistance? Is it nuclear technology, not only money? So I think this is also a call for countries that have been sitting on the fence, that feel they're far away from this conflict, like India, like Japan, like South Korea. I just noticed the other day, Taiwan has donated a lot of missile defense batteries to Kyiv as well. These are US-made kit. So once again, I mean, by this war becoming so globalized, it is going to hit these countries sooner or later. One more point is, as you well know, for the longest time, Russia has been constraining the flow of food from where I live, Odessa port, to the world, including to some very, very needy countries. About 2 weeks ago, there were no ships waiting to enter Odessa. It's the first time I've seen that for a long, long time. Apparently, ship owners were tipped off that the Russians are going to send more missiles to the Odessa region, and they fled unloaded. It didn't get widely reported, but I saw it with my very own eyes. So President Zelensky once said, is why is it that a small group of men in the Kremlin are able to dictate what we eat at our dinner tables or how much we pay for it? And then one more thing, if foreign reporting is to be believed, Russians have also been providing targeting information to the Iran-backed Houthi rebels to strike commercial ships in the Red Sea, a key trade artery. Why is there no more screaming about that? These are very, very provocative, disruptive actions on the part of the Kremlin.
And just, Michael, finally, in the coming days and weeks, what are you going to be focusing your attention on? What are you going to be looking out for?
Yeah, aside from the kind of smaller things, new appointments from the US, but also the Ukrainian side, is that very, very big one ask from the Ukrainians is whether the permission to use Storm shuttle missiles will be acted upon for Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia. I think that's really crucial. I think we're also going to be watching what happens in Europe. The president of Finland has come out quite strongly saying that we have to help Ukraine with these negotiations to decide things about land and over security guarantees, the reparations and the reconstruction. There's going to be a lot more huddling going on between European leaders. Of course, you have people like Hungary's Orban on the side saying, no, we have to negotiate with Russia. It'll be interesting to see whether he's going to be the peace whisperer to Mr. Trump as well, given their relationship. So this is something I've predicted for quite some time, is that more and more the responsibility for helping Ukraine push back Mr. Putin will fall on European shoulders, and even more so on nearby neighbors like Poland, like the Baltic states. Of course, they don't have the financial heft, military heft that the US can provide. But, like I said earlier, I think other countries which have a lot of ability to provide weaponry and financial assistance, for example, India, need to come and step up to the plate, because day by day, Kate, this is becoming much, much more of a globalized war. And I think Mr. Modi and others are deluding themselves if they think that this hybrid, this terroristic actions by Mr. Putin is not going to affect their economies.
Appreciate you spending some time with us. Michael Bociurkiv, thank you very much.
As always, a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.